Okie dokie, well, I'll go ahead and get started, and anybody who joins later can catch up a little bit. But my name is Sarah Staples, and I'm the Helen Steiner Rice Archivist at the Cincinnati Museum Center. I work in the Cincinnati History Library and Archive, and my position is named after a very brilliant woman, of course, named Helen Steiner Rice. And a lot of people know her for her poetry. She didn't become famous until later in her life, so not very many people know very much about her early life. And it really is a story of persistence. She was born in Lorain, Ohio in May 19th, 1900. And I just loved that adorable little baby picture of her. She had a loving family. She had her father, John, her mother, her sister, Gertrude, and her mother, Anna. She had dreams of going to law school. She had plans to go to Wesleyan University at first, and then transferring to Ohio State University to go to law school. However, her father died in the 1918 influenza pandemic, so connection to nowadays. And all of a sudden, her family had no one to support him. Her father had worked for the railroad for 20, 30 years. And so she had to enter the workforce to support her sister. And that death really was the first major tragedy of her life, and she will have others. Her first job was with the Electric Light and Power Company of Lorain, Ohio. She first started...
I know, but I'm on something right now. You can
Brenda, you're not muted.
For your truck, or you can make a street on it, like a...
But she started with teaching people how to decorate and make their own silk lampshades. So that was a really niche market, but she was so successful at it that she quickly became an advertising manager for the branch. And that was in the executive portion of the company. And there were very few women that were even above secretary, so that was very influential, and it just showed how hard she worked. As far as afterwards, she moved on to work for the Ohio Public Service Company. She was the spokesperson for that. Oh, and just her rhymes and jingles to promote her products at the Electric Light and Power Company were really memorable and really brought her to attention of a lot of people in all sorts of industries. And after her great work with those two electric and public service companies, she became known as the Lorain Tornado, just because of how energetic she was and just how captivating of a speaker she was. And she really brought people into the fold and was educational as well as entertaining. She was a big outspoken advocate for hiring and promoting women. Just a few names of the articles that she wrote in newspapers and magazines. Women have one great opportunity because the men won't let us. Women as a power in the electrical industry. Build sales and men, a good story of construction or constructive merchandising, and just as well as just general business topics. But she really, really promoted that women can be more than secretaries if you give them a chance. By overlooking them, you are doing a disservice to your business. And so that was very uncommon for the time. Many women did not work at all, but of course, some women had to, like she did, because of her father's death. And she just thought that women should be given the opportunity to do the great work that they could do. She branched out even more than being a well-respected businesswoman. She started her own business, the Steiner Service, where she did motivational lectures. And if you can see her charges here, She charged $50 to $75 for her speeches, and this was back in the 20s. I just love her. More pep, more zip, more power, more zest. And she was hired by businesses all across the country, not just Ohio, not just Dayton and the Cincinnati area, New York, banking institutions, just a wide variety of businesses paid her to lecture in the 1920s, and she just was incredibly successful and did it all on her own. I love her little hat. And just so many newspaper columnists, businessmen, they wrote such, glowing reviews of her, and she was able to provide for her and her family with just her business. It's just remarkable. She did find love in her life. She married Franklin Rice, who was a successful banker in Dayton, Ohio. They were married January 30th, 1929, and they took a worldwide cruise that took most of 1929 up. She did get married in New York, where Franklin's brother was a big, very fancy businessman who had tons of money. So he threw them a wedding. I believe it was, I forget the name of the hotel, but it was a very fancy hotel in New York. Unfortunately, the New York stock market crashed at the end of 1929, and Franklin lost his job and most of his money. So again, Helen had to return to work in 1931, and she worked for Gibson Art Company in Cincinnati, Ohio. And she's a great businesswoman, but this is the second time she's had to work because she's had to. And unfortunately, another tragedy strikes her life. Her husband, Franklin, commits suicide October 10th, 1932. He was still living in Dayton, and she lived with him every weekend, but she stayed in a hotel, the Hotel Gibson in Cincinnati, during the week while she worked her job at Gibson Art Company. And just this letter is just gut-wrenching. When she hasn't heard from him in a couple of days, she writes him, "What's wrong? I've been calling and you haven't called me back. I've been going to the P.O. box every hour to check to see if you've written me." And it's a little bit of an ongoing joke with archivists and historians that most people in letters go, "You haven't written in forever." They always talk about how the person hasn't written and they're in big trouble. And so she halfway jokingly writes this letter, but she very quickly realizes that something is seriously wrong, and she finally gets a hold of somebody who goes to check on him, and they find him in their home. And this death just crushes her. Along with her father's death, she just has a very hard time dealing with, especially October is a very hard month, and she writes a lot of poetry about grief and survival, and it's very heartfelt. But she continues working at Gibson Art Company. She loves it, but of course she has to because there's no one else in her life to support her. She's hired as a marketing agent, but she's quickly promoted to editor. She writes countless humorous, inspirational verses for greeting cards. She's very well known for this in the industry, and she does have a few people that know her outside of the industry, but in general, I mean, when you buy a greeting card, you don't always look at the author of the poem that's in the card or something like that. So she has a little bit of recognition, but nowhere near nationwide. And also, she's got another great hat. She's very well known for hats. You'll see that in a minute. She lives most of her adult life in the Sheraton Gibson Hotel. We have receipts from her hotel stay, and she lives in a hotel room, and it's so cool to think about room service and everything. She's like Eloise. But she gains national fame when Aladdin on the Lawrence Welk Show reads her poem, The Priceless Gift of Christmas. And then the second poem he reads is The Praying Hands, and that is a poem that is very well known for her. And it's reprinted on so many cards and in books, and it touches very many people. But her national fame, she starts publishing books. I love this one with its little groovy 70s cover. Holidays are her specialty. I just finished doing some Mother's Day poetry readings. She does personal appearances, book signings, all across the country. She's very well known at this point. But at this point, she's in her 60s, so it's definitely later in her life that she gets this national fame. And in Cincinnati, she's very well known for her flamboyant original hats. As you can see in all these pictures, she does love hats throughout her life, but towards the end of her life is where she gets really fun with them. Lots of feathers. But before she passes away, she sets up the Helen Steiner Rice Foundation with her long-time lawyer, Mr. Ruhlman, and they provide grants for nonprofit organizations that specialize in needy, elderly, and poor people. She dies in Cincinnati on April 23rd, 1981. Her foundation stays independent for more than 30 years, but in 2008, I believe, 2008, the Cincinnati History Museum is selected to be the organization to run her foundation, and that's where my position comes in. I take copyright requests from people that want to use her poems in publications, newsletters, if they want to do like public readings. We have a lot of nonprofit organizations that want to use her poems. Trying to think, churches and can't think of the word. Hospice organizations like to give out glossy handouts with her poems on grief, and but we do have a lot of individual people that find them inspirational, and they've written books and they want to put those in there, put special poems. One lady recently, her mother passed away, and she just had this inkling that she needed to go to her mother's drawer and look in it, and at the very bottom there was a note with a poem about mothers, and the mother had written, "This is to you, my daughter," and she just felt it in her heart that she needed to go to that drawer and look. So I hear inspirational stories like that all the time. So hopefully I went a little fast, but do you have any questions?
So Sarah, you said that she worked at Gibson. Was she hired to do greeting cards or more like inspirational stuff? Well, I know a lot of those cards early on were pretty much inspirational, but
yeah. Well, she was hired on as an advertising manager because of her work with the electrical companies and things like that. But she quickly moved on to editor because of, the jingles and poems and things like that she wrote, that I think they saw her more valuable in content rather than in advertising. But I'm sure she still worked in advertising too, just because she was very talented at it.
cool.
Did she ever have children, or are there remaining relatives of hers in the Cincinnati area?
Unfortunately, she never had children, and I don't believe her sister ever married or had children either. So there may be distant cousins in Lorraine, but there's definitely not any buddy in Cincinnati. Her business legacy is about the only thing that's here.
Well, what about where her hats go? Do people have her hats?
I believe the museum has one or two. And as far as I would say there's probably some in Lorraine as well. And like her lawyers might have, because her estate was managed by her lawyers for so long that I'm sure they had them for a little while, but I'm not exactly sure where the whole collection went.
Wow, that's a shame.
Sarah, do you typically allow people to use her poems, or is there an instance where you would not give permission?
As far as there's very few times I don't think I've really ever said no. As if you are selling something and you want to include her poem in it, there is a use fee. So sometimes people don't want to pay that, so they don't end up using it. But as far as you can't manipulate the poem at all or change it, so as long as someone doesn't want to do that, and they just have to be a certified nonprofit sort of thing, or it's got to be for like a small family project. Like I've had a few people that have wanted to make like family cookbooks and they want to include a poem or something like that. And if it's a very small project, we'll allow them to do it for either a very small fee just to cover administrative costs, or none at all if it's just very little.
So Sarah, it sounds like this would make a great little exhibit sometime.
Oh, I think so. And a lot of these photos I borrowed from books that I had that I brought from the museum, but there's so much more that I don't have access to. Like I wanted a lot of these newspaper articles I've read, but I couldn't remember exactly like quotes. She's got great quotes about women working, but they're all in my desk and I didn't even think to bring them home. And and then like knowing exactly like what hats we have of hers, or any other like outfits, or the personal effects that we have of hers. I'm on the paper side of the museum in the archive, so I know there's probably historical objects that we have, but since it's not my collection, I haven't gone in and really taken a look. But yeah, it would be very cool, especially with the suffrage exhibit that we have put together that hasn't opened yet because of all of this. Her advocacy for women working was just so special back then. And because she specialized in Christian poetry, a lot of people, it's very conservative kind of field, and she just didn't follow those lines as far as, women working and staying exclusively in the home and things like that. And that's just, it's very cool in my book.
So did she get married in the Waldorf Astoria?
I think so. I think that was it. I've got a menu from her wedding, so I'm just gonna stop this and I'm gonna see if I can pull it up.
I love that idea, Bob, about doing an exhibit. I think that would be great.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know anything about her life, so I think it sounds fascinating. So, yeah.
Some people would describe her poetry as a little bit sweet, kind of sickly sweet, and just her person was so much different than that.
You mean she wasn't a sweet person, or what do you mean by that?
Oh, it because it's so rhyming, and because she wrote about kind of flowery topics. She wrote about grief and serious topics too, but one of her biography is The Ambassador of Sunshine. Just she was very positive and uplifting, and she acknowledged the darkness of life, but as far as her material is not very dark. It's more uplifting than
How old was she when she passed?
80 or 80 or 81, because she was born in 1900. Yeah.
So are there very many books written about her?
As far as about her, I know that there are two. There is this small little bit more small publication of a biography, and then the major one is the one that I mentioned before, The Ambassador of Sunshine. And then there's tons of books of her poetry. This one is probably the biggest complete collection of her poetry. Of course, it's not complete because she wrote for so many years that I don't know if any book has ever been complete with all of her poetry in it. But this is probably the most encompassing. But there's just tons of, the little books put out. And there's even teeny tiny books like this big. Or tiny book collection. So.
Can you put up that original, your first photo that you had of her describing the talk? Or the one that you had that said Helen Steiner Rice?
Oh, the very first one?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Good. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That was interesting.
Sarah.
Oh, you're welcome. I did find the menu if anybody's interested. I'm waiting for it to load.
Okay.
Sure.
My guess would have been the Waldorf also back in New York. Oh, there it is.
The plaza.
Oh.
Okay.
And I loved their menu. Alligator Pear, Florida. I don't even know what that is, but it sounds like
Sounds gross.
It sounds like it would be cute, like little pears shaped like alligators or something.
Nope, sounds gross.
Lobster
Yeah, that's not bad.
and partridge.
Yep.
Yeah, boy.
Floating Heart Helene. I wonder what that is.
I don't know, but I can do the cakes and coffee.
I wonder if it's like Floating Island, which is, I can't remember. I think that's a dessert, but it might be a cheese thing. I can't remember. But yeah, prior 50s and earlier cuisine is very interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
Wow.
But yeah,
You
that
know,
was
really,
his brother Elwood Rice.
when she died in 1981, that doesn't sound like that's so long ago, because that's when I graduated from high school.
Me too.
You know, I don't think that sounds so long ago.
Working in an archive, I constantly am like, oh, they only died in 1900. And they're like,
Right.
that was 120 years ago. And I said, yeah, but it doesn't seem that long ago, just because I worked in that time period all the time.
Right, for sure.
But then there's some people who are like, 2003. I'm like, dear heavens.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yep.
All right, well, thank you very much. Everybody have a good
Welcome.
rest of the day.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. You did a great
Thank you,
job.
everybody. Thanks for coming.
Yep.
Bye.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.